Agenda for today, we're going to read a short story text, then answer a few multiple choice questions about the story, and then do an open response analyzing what you read. We'll go into more detail about each of these in the next slides. The text we're reading today is about a teenage girl named Maria. Her relationship with her family is kind of changing and evolving throughout the story as she also is growing up throughout the story. The story is a realistic fiction short story or narrative text, which means it's not a true story. They aren't based on real characters, but nothing unrealistic happens. It's not fantasy, like everything could happen in real life. It's set in California, so a lot of the places that are talked about in the story are actual real places in California. For example, they talk about visiting Great America, which is a theme park similar to like Six Flags or Canopy Lake Park in California. They also mention a few cities in California, namely Fresno, Salinas, and San Jose. You can see each of those just appeared on the map. Several of the vocabulary words that might be unfamiliar are actually already defined on the Common Lit site that you're going to be working off of. You'll know this because these words are marked with footnotes. A footnote, as you'll see in the picture on the right here, is a little tiny number that comes after a word or a phrase in a text. That indicates that that word has a definition or an explanation about it at the very bottom of the text. So when you see that little number, you'll scroll down to the bottom where it says notes in your text, and then that same number next to it will offer the definition or explanation of that word. Some other vocabulary that'll help you as you read. Reluctantly, which means you do something, but it's clear that you feel sort of shy or uncomfortable doing it and that you don't really want to, but you just kind of do it anyway. I've got a word gruffness, which means, somebody who's kind of rough, kind of like a tough person and a little bit difficult. This word anxiety, which is just feelings of extreme nervousness or worry. And finally, obnoxious, which is just people who are generally rude and unpleasant. As always, when you're working through vocabulary, some strategies to help you figure out the meanings of words that are unfamiliar when you read. Number one, use context clues. So I have this example here. I zorned over the fence. Now, obviously, zorned is not a word, but based on context clues, if you eliminate that word that you don't know, zorned, and substitute in a word that you do know that might make sense here, I think you could make a pretty educated guess that zorned could mean jumped over the fence or flew over the fence or leaped over the fence, right? All of those would make sense in that context. Other strategies, you can break down the word. So I have this word unbelievable. Break that into its pieces. We know that's like a negative prefix. It means not. Believe, to think something is true. And then able, if you're able to do something, you can do it. So unbelievable, broken down piece by piece, not able to believe something. So use the pieces of the word to put together the full puzzle. And lastly, if those fail you, you can always look in a dictionary, either English to English or English to Spanish, whatever you find more helpful. We've got some new question types on the multiple choice section today. First, you're going to be looking to find or identify the theme of the story, theme being the sort of major universal lesson that we can learn from reading it. You're going to be asked to identify the strongest piece of evidence to support your claim in a prior question. So I've been identifying a piece of text that proves your answer to the previous question was correct. We've got an author's craft question, which again is just the reasoning behind why authors include certain things in the text or make certain choices as they're writing and what that accomplishes for the reader. And lastly, a question about character change, which is sort of comparing how a character's attitude is at the beginning of a story versus at the end of the story, and what can we learn about how that character has changed and developed as a result of that. When you're answering multiple choice, remember your strategies. Break down the question, annotate the question, figure out exactly what it's asking you, then start eliminating answers that are obviously wrong, aka slash the trash. Once you've broken down the question and eliminated clearly wrong answers, you want to look for ways that a question could be distracting you, why it's almost correct, but not quite there. That's the distractors we're looking to label. And ultimately, you're debating between maybe your last two answers. You choose the best one, the one that is most closely related to the answer that the author is looking for. As we get to the open response, we've got a new prompt today. It's asking us, how does Maria's changing attitude emphasize the theme of the short story? Use details from the text to support your answer. Right, so as we break down that question, we see that we have a couple of tasks. First, we need to identify how Maria's attitude is changing, right? So we're looking at her attitude or how she feels at first versus her attitude and how she feels later in the story. And we use that discrepancy to identify how her attitude changes over the course of the text. Now, that change that we identify in her is going to help reveal the ultimate theme or lesson that the author is hoping to teach us as we read this short story text. An example of this type of response could be if in a story, at the beginning of the story, Mr. Fitzgerald is on a basketball team and prefers to shoot the ball himself every time and score as many points as he can. But then as the story develops, later on, Mr. Fitzgerald starts to have fun passing to his teammates, right? And so we identify that since he at first liked to shoot every time and later liked to share the ball with his teammates, that his change in attitude is from unselfish to selfish. That change in his attitude could teach us a lesson that selfishness is never as satisfying as sharing success with others, for example. So just like Mr. Fitzgerald's attitude changes in that example, and we use that change in his attitude to learn an overall lesson, we're going to similarly look for a change in Maria's attitude between earlier and later in the story, and use Maria's changing attitude to identify a theme or lesson that we can learn from that change. As far as the structure for this response goes, really make sure you track the CFS for structure that are in the classwork assignment. They go into really great detail about the exact structure that's expected in each section of this essay, but general layout is 4 paragraphs, being 1, your intro, which includes your thesis, 2, a body paragraph, 3, a second body paragraph, and 4, your conclusion paragraph.